At the heart of World War II history, between documented reality and the kinds of dramatic claims that arise in wartime rumor, post-war memory, and later retellings. To examine what Patton did in response to such a story, it is first necessary to understand whether the event itself could have occurred, what the operational environment of the U-boat war actually looked like, and how senior commanders reacted to extraordinary claims in a conflict defined by pressure, uncertainty, and consequence. By 1942 and 1943, German Type IX submarines were among the most formidable weapons in the Kriegsmarine's arsenal. Larger than the more numerous Type WWII boats, they were designed for long-range patrols, capable of operating far into the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the waters off the American coast. These submarines carried experienced crews, heavy torpedo loads, and in many cases, deck guns. They were not fragile targets easily destroyed by chance or improvisation, and sinking even one required coordinated detection, trained crews, and usually multiple attack runs. The destruction of 3 such submarines in 30 minutes would have represented an unprecedented tactical event, immediately recorded, analyzed, and disseminated through Allied naval command structures. At the same time, the early years of the Battle of the Atlantic were marked by confusion, incomplete information, and inflated or mistaken claims. Explosions, oil slicks, debris fields, and sonar contacts were often misinterpreted under combat stress. Escort vessels sometimes believed they had destroyed a submarine, when in fact the target escaped damaged or untouched. Allied navies themselves acknowledged after the war that confirmed sinkings were fewer than wartime reports suggested. This environment created fertile ground for dramatic stories, particularly those that elevated ordinary individuals into symbols of sudden heroism. The notion of a naval cook sinking submarines taps into a broader wartime pattern in which non-specialists were occasionally thrust into combat roles by circumstance. Sailors trained for auxiliary duties manned guns during air attacks. Merchant seamen dropped depth charges when escorts were absent. In rare cases, luck and quick action produced genuine results, but these incidents were almost always limited in scale and carefully investigated afterward. The destruction of a Type IX submarine was not something that could occur unnoticed or unverified, let alone 3 in rapid succession. George S. Patton's role in this narrative introduces another layer of complexity. Patton was an Army officer, not a naval commander, and had no direct authority over anti-submarine warfare. His responsibilities lay with armored forces, ground operations, and later the liberation of Western Europe. Yet Patton was deeply interested in morale, publicity, and the psychological dimensions of war. He followed developments across the services closely, believed strongly in aggressive action, and was keenly aware of how stories, true or exaggerated, could influence both soldiers and the public. Patton's writings reveal a man skeptical of miracle stories, but attentive to symbols of initiative and audacity. He admired boldness when it was grounded in competence and discipline, and he distrusted narratives that implied success without preparation. In his view, war rewarded those who mastered their profession, not those who stumbled into victory by accident. Any report claiming that an untrained cook had destroyed multiple advanced submarines would have immediately triggered scrutiny, rather than celebration in Patton's mind. To understand how such a claim would be handled, it is useful to examine how the Allied command structure processed extraordinary combat reports. Naval engagements were logged in detail. Sonar contacts, attack runs, depth charge patterns, and post-attack evidence were all recorded. Confirmation required corroboration from multiple sources, escort logs, intelligence intercepts, and later in the war, German records. Inflated claims were quietly corrected as information improved. Senior commanders learned to balance the need for morale-boosting stories with the danger of building doctrine or confidence on false premises. In this system, A report attributing 3 Type IX sinkings to a single individual outside a trained anti-submarine crew would have raised immediate questions. Who detected the submarines? What weapons were used? Where were the escorts? How were the sinkings confirmed? The absence of clear, documented answers would quickly relegate such a story to rumor rather than record. Patton, known for his insistence on factual after-action reports, would not have accepted such a claim at face value. The persistence of stories like this one reflects the human need to personalize vast, impersonal conflicts. World War II was fought by millions, and its outcomes were shaped by logistics, industry, and coordinated strategy. Yet memory gravitates toward individuals. The image of a cook defeating elite submariners compresses complexity into a single, emotionally satisfying narrative. It suggests that courage alone can overturn material and training advantages, an idea appealing in wartime but misleading in historical analysis. Patton himself understood this tension. He cultivated an image of personal ferocity and genius, yet he repeatedly emphasized training, discipline, and preparation. His speeches stressed that bravery without competence led to unnecessary death. In private correspondence, he dismissed exaggerated accounts that obscured the real causes of success or failure. If confronted with a claim of a cook sinking 3 submarines, Patton's reaction would likely have been less about the individual and more about what the story revealed regarding reporting standards and morale management. This does not mean that Patton was indifferent to the symbolic value of such tales. He understood that soldiers and civilians alike needed stories that made sense of chaos, but he also believed that myths, if left unchallenged, could distort expectations and undermine professionalism. For Patton, the danger was not that people admired a cook's supposed heroism, but that they might begin to believe war could be won without rigorous preparation and command discipline. The reality of anti-submarine warfare underscores this point. By the later stages of the war, Allied success against U-boats resulted from improved sonar, radar, air coverage, intelligence from decrypted German communications, and coordinated hunter-killer groups. Victories were cumulative and systemic. Individual acts mattered, but only within a structure that allowed those acts to be effective. No single person, trained or untrained, could independently destroy multiple advanced submarines in minutes without that system behind them. Understanding what Patton did in response to such a story, therefore, requires reframing the question. Rather than searching for a dramatic reaction, the historical record points toward a quieter, more consequential process. The continual effort by senior commanders to separate usable lessons from noise, to reward genuine initiative without encouraging fantasy, and to maintain morale without sacrificing truth. In this sense, the story, true or not, illustrates how pressure and uncertainty shaped not only battlefield actions, but also the way those actions were interpreted and remembered. As World War II progressed, the gap between rumor and record narrowed. Improved intelligence and post-war access to German archives allowed historians to match claims with losses. Many dramatic stories faded under scrutiny, others were confirmed and contextualized. The absence of any documented case matching the claim of a naval cook sinking 3 Type IX submarines in 30 minutes speaks not to a failure of recognition, but to the rigor of historical verification. What remains is a lens through which to examine wartime psychology and command culture. Patton's world was one in which exaggerated claims could inspire or mislead, and where leaders had to navigate between encouragement and correction. The pressure to believe in extraordinary success was constant, especially during periods of heavy loss. The consequence of indulging such beliefs without evidence could be strategic complacency. In that environment, Patton's likely response was not theatrical praise or outrage, but disciplined skepticism. He would have demanded facts, understood the morale function of the story, and then moved on to the business he believed actually won wars: training, planning, and relentless execution. The persistence of the story today reflects how the war continues to be shaped by narrative long after the guns fell silent, leaving open further examination of how myths form, why they endure, and how they intersect with the documented realities of global conflict under extreme pressure. The endurance of such stories also points toward a broader wartime pattern in which extraordinary claims often surface during moments of strategic anxiety, when losses were heavy and victories uncertain. In the Atlantic, this dynamic was especially pronounced. U-boats operated invisibly, striking without warning and vanishing beneath the surface, leaving behind wreckage and unanswered questions. For sailors and commanders alike, the psychological toll of fighting an unseen enemy created a hunger for decisive, almost miraculous reversals. Any report that suggested sudden dominance over the submarine threat, regardless of its source, carried emotional weight far beyond its evidentiary value. Within Allied headquarters, this environment forced leaders to develop a disciplined approach to information. Claims were not simply evaluated for their inspirational potential, but weighed against their operational implications. A falsely credited sinking could distort assessments of enemy strength, alter convoy routing decisions, or lead to incorrect conclusions about tactics and weapons effectiveness. Senior commanders learned that optimism unsupported by evidence could be as dangerous as pessimism. This was particularly true in anti-submarine warfare, where statistical overconfidence in success rates might reduce vigilance at precisely the wrong moment. Patton's own career had already demonstrated the cost of misinterpretation and rumor. From the aftermath of the Kasserine pass to the controversies surrounding his conduct in Sicily, he had seen how narratives, once detached from context, could reshape reputations and careers. He understood that in wartime, stories traveled faster than corrections, and that once a dramatic account entered public consciousness, it became resistant to revision. This awareness made him wary of any tale that seemed to elevate chance above command competence. The contrast between Army and Navy cultures also mattered. Naval warfare, especially submarine hunting, relied heavily on technical systems and coordinated teamwork. Success was rarely attributable to a single action or individual. Even when a specific crew delivered the killing blow, it was usually the result of layered detection, intelligence cues, and sustained pursuit. Army officers like Patton, who emphasized combined arms and operational tempo, recognized parallels between armored warfare and naval combat in this regard. Both required synchronization rather than improvisation. As the war progressed, Allied leaders increasingly emphasized documented lessons learned. Training manuals were updated based on confirmed engagements. Tactical doctrines evolved through careful analysis of what had actually worked, not what was rumored to have succeeded. In this process, stories that could not be substantiated quietly fell away, replaced by data-driven conclusions. This approach helped transform the Battle of the Atlantic from a crisis into a managed campaign, where losses, though still painful, were no longer strategically decisive. The idea that a single, untrained individual could upend this balance clashes with the institutional memory preserved in after-action reports and post-war studies. Historians examining Allied and German records have found no evidence supporting such an event, reinforcing the understanding that while individual courage was common, individual decisiveness at that scale was not. This absence is itself instructive, highlighting how easily later retellings can compress complex systems into singular moments. In examining what Patton did, it becomes clear that his significance lies less in any direct response to a specific claim and more in his embodiment of a command philosophy shaped by relentless scrutiny. He believed that leadership demanded clarity amid confusion, and that resisting comforting falsehoods was part of a commander's duty. War, in his view, punished those who mistook anecdotes for evidence. This philosophy was shared, to varying degrees, across the Allied high command. Figures like Eisenhower, Marshall, and King each grappled with the tension between morale and accuracy. They recognized that morale built on illusion could collapse when confronted with reality, whereas confidence grounded in preparation and honest assessment proved more resilient. The handling of extraordinary claims thus became a quiet but crucial aspect of wartime leadership. The persistence of the Cook and Submarine story into modern discussions reveals how memory selects for drama over process. It underscores the importance of historical method in separating symbolic narratives from operational truth. By tracing how such stories would have been received, evaluated, and ultimately set aside by commanders like Patton, a clearer picture emerges of how World War II was actually fought, not as a series of isolated miracles, but as an accumulation of decisions made under pressure, constrained by uncertainty, and judged by their long-term consequences rather than their immediate appeal. The analytical separation between legend and record became even more pronounced in the immediate post-war years, when Allied militaries undertook systematic reviews of their campaigns. Naval boards examined every claimed submarine sinking, cross-referencing sonar logs, air patrol reports, wreckage sightings, and when available, captured German records. These studies revealed how frequently early wartime claims had been inflated by the chaos of combat. Explosions thought to indicate a kill were often depth charges detonating at preset depths or underwater geological effects misinterpreted amid stress and noise. As these findings accumulated, they reinforced an institutional skepticism toward dramatic, unverified accounts, no matter how appealing they were to public imagination. German naval archives, recovered and analyzed after the war, further clarified the picture. Type IX submarines were large, long-range vessels whose operational losses were carefully documented by the Kriegsmarine. Sinkings tended to be associated with prolonged engagements involving multiple Allied assets, surface escorts coordinating with aircraft, guided by intelligence from signals interception and convoy tracking. The absence of any record indicating 3 Type IX losses within a 30-minute window, attributable to a single vessel or individual, underscored the improbability of the claim and highlighted the rigor of historical cross-verification. This process of reconciliation between Allied and Axis records illustrates a broader truth about World War II. Outcomes were shaped by systems rather than singular acts. Anti-submarine warfare evolved through incremental improvements in radar, sonar, high-frequency direction finding, and convoy doctrine. Each advancement reduced uncertainty slightly, narrowing the operational space in which U-boats could operate. Success emerged from persistence and adaptation, not from isolated moments of improvisation. Understanding this helps explain why commanders like Patton, despite their flair and rhetoric, ultimately relied on structured analysis rather than anecdote. Patton's own writings reveal a consistent preoccupation with cause and effect. He framed warfare as a contest governed by principles that rewarded preparation and punished complacency. When evaluating stories from other theaters, he tended to look for underlying mechanisms. What training enabled the action, what coordination made it possible, and how it could be replicated. A story lacking these elements offered no practical value to a commander responsible for thousands of lives and miles of front. In this sense, dismissing or ignoring such tales was not cynicism but professional discipline. The interaction between land and naval warfare also shaped how information flowed. While Patton commanded armies advancing across Europe, his operations depended indirectly on naval success. Supplies, reinforcements, and fuel crossed oceans before reaching his columns. Any misunderstanding of the maritime situation could affect planning at the front. Overestimating Allied dominance at sea, even rhetorically, risked underestimating logistical vulnerability. This interdependence reinforced the need for accuracy across domains, linking the Atlantic directly to the fields and towns of continental Europe. Public narratives, however, followed different incentives. Wartime and post-war audiences gravitated toward stories that personalized vast conflicts. A cook sinking submarines offered a human-scale entry point into an otherwise abstract struggle. Such stories persisted because they simplified complexity and celebrated the idea that ordinary individuals could change history overnight. While this impulse was understandable, it often obscured the collective effort that actually defined Allied victory. Historians, tasked with reconstructing events from fragmented evidence, have emphasized the danger of allowing these narratives to stand unchallenged. Doing so risks miseducating future generations about how wars are won and lost. The focus shifts from organization, leadership, and sustained effort to chance and heroics. In examining how figures like Patton would have approached such claims, historians gain insight into the professional mindset required to manage large-scale conflict. The endurance of these myths also reflects how memory interacts with authority. Associating an extraordinary event with a well-known commander lends it credibility, even when no documentary link exists. Patton's reputation for boldness makes him a convenient anchor for dramatic stories. Yet this same reputation was built on relentless training, strict discipline, and an intolerance for ambiguity in command. Recognizing this tension helps demystify both the man and the myths attached to him. As scholarship continues to refine our understanding of World War II, the contrast between documented operations and popular legend remains instructive. It reveals how pressure and uncertainty shaped not only battlefield decisions, but also the stories told afterward. The consequences of these narratives extend beyond entertainment, influencing how strategy, leadership, and sacrifice are perceived. By following the thread of how such a claim would have been evaluated, contextualized, and ultimately set aside by contemporary commanders, the historical record remains open for further exploration into the realities of command, credibility, and decision-making under the extreme conditions of global war. The methodological discipline applied after the war reshaped how future militaries approached both storytelling and doctrine. Training institutions incorporated case studies that emphasized verified engagements, deliberately stripping away embellishment to focus on reproducible principles. This shift reflected a hard-earned lesson from World War II, that clarity about what actually happened was essential for preparing officers to operate under uncertainty. By prioritizing documented cause-and-effect relationships, post-war analysts aimed to prevent the recurrence of strategic misjudgments rooted in exaggerated success. In this framework, Patton's legacy is better understood through his insistence on momentum, logistics, and pressure, rather than through isolated anecdotes. His campaigns demonstrated how speed could compensate for imperfect information, but only when grounded in realistic assessments of capability. He understood that confidence had to be earned through rehearsal and planning, not borrowed from stories of improbable feats. This outlook aligned with broader Allied reforms that sought to professionalize analysis across services. The Atlantic Campaign provided a parallel lesson. As convoy systems matured and coordination improved, Allied commanders learned to interpret data conservatively. A suspected kill remained provisional until corroborated, and operational plans assumed the enemy remained capable until proven otherwise. This conservative bias reduced vulnerability to surprise and forced continuous improvement. It also discouraged the elevation of unverified claims into doctrinal guidance. German records, once fully examined, reinforced the asymmetry between perception and reality. U-boat losses, though severe by 1943 and 1944, followed discernible patterns tied to Allied adaptation rather than sudden collapses. The steady attrition reflected a campaign of endurance rather than moments of spectacular reversal. Understanding this pattern underscores why stories of instant, total victories at sea failed to influence serious operational planning. The persistence of such stories in popular memory highlights the gap between professional military culture and civilian interpretation. Where professionals seek repeatable lessons, popular narratives often seek meaning through symbolism. This divergence does not diminish the value of either perspective, but it does require careful separation when analyzing historical causality. Commanders like Patton operated firmly within the former, valuing actionable truth over inspirational fiction. As Cold War tensions emerged, the emphasis on verification gained renewed importance. Nuclear-age planning left even less room for myth-based confidence. The analytical habits forged during World War II, cross-checking sources, demanding corroboration, and resisting anecdotal temptation, became institutionalized. In this sense, the quiet dismissal of extraordinary but unsupported claims contributed indirectly to post-war stability by reinforcing disciplined decision-making. The story's endurance also invites reflection on how war narratives evolve over time. Each retelling adapts to contemporary values, sometimes elevating individual agency as a counterbalance to the overwhelming scale of global conflict. Yet the archival record remains a corrective, reminding us that wars are shaped by accumulation of resources, decisions, and sustained effort, rather than by isolated moments. Examining how such a claim would have been filtered through Patton's worldview illuminates the broader architecture of Allied command. Decisions were shaped by pressure to act quickly, uncertainty about enemy intent, and the consequences of error measured in lives and territory. Within that environment, the discipline to disregard unproven stories was itself a form of leadership. This lens keeps the narrative open, not as a tale of a single dramatic episode, but as an ongoing inquiry into how information, belief, and authority interacted during World War II. It invites further exploration of the mechanisms by which commanders maintained clarity amid chaos, and how the balance between morale and accuracy influenced outcomes across land and sea as the war reshaped modern history.